Hi. I certainly want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I think I actually want to start my talk quickly um, by sort of reinforcing a point, the basic point of Dr. Pike's statement. I think it's absolutely critical that the Dalit community connect with African American women. For the African American community over the last 30 years, Black women have outnumbered Black men in college degrees 2-to-1. So the rising group of Black academics are much more likely to be female than male. And the connection then to Dalit women is going to be absolutely critical. Okay, the title of my talks is History of the African American Relationship to the Oppression on the Indian Subcontinent. And what I want to do is I want to spend about 20 minutes talking about that, but then I want to reserve 5 minutes just to talk about the Cisco case, because I think there are things that have happened with American law that very few Dalits are aware of now that impacts the Cisco case. But in my first part here, talking about the history of African-American relationship to the oppression on the Indian subcontinent, one of the things that really sort of stands in the way of African-American Dalit relationships is the history of the African-American relationship with oppression on the Indian subcontinent. So I want to talk about that because we got to clear that history in order to create the space for us today to talk about Dalit African-American alliances. So let me start. Well, once again, Dr. Pike had talked about Fule and his connection of the caste system to the African-American struggle in his 1873 book. It actually turns out from the standpoint of the American side, abolitionists in the North began to analogize the treatment of Blacks in this country to the Indian caste system back in the 1830s. They used the caste system to critique the treatment of Blacks, both in terms of slavery in the South and in terms of the discrimination that Blacks experienced in the North. Now that caste analogy would be the significant international analogy that the Black community will draw on all through the entire 19th century. It shows up again in the debates about equality up to our Civil War. On the other side of our Civil War in the 1860s, when America's debating 3 new constitutional amendments to be added to the Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment that includes our equal protection language, the caste amendment, the caste analogy is at the center of it, where the proponents of the amendment are saying that the purpose of it is to disestablish caste in the United States. Caste will continue to be important in the debates about race equality. And there's a very famous 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court upheld the doctrine of separate but equal. 8 members of the court said, we find this doctrine constitutional, but 1 member, Justice Harlan, wrote in dissent. And Justice Harlan's dissent is probably the single most famous opinion written by a Supreme Court justice in American history. In his dissent, Harlan will write, in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. So once again, you see the importance of the caste language. When the NAACP creates its organization in 1910, its very first objective is that we will fight against caste-based discrimination in the United States. So the caste analogy to the Black struggle had been there since the 1830s, all the way through the 19th century, up into the beginnings of the 20th century. And indeed, people still talk about it today. Isabella Wilkerson's new book coming out next week, for example, will mention caste in the title. But from the standpoint of the Black community over here, we did not understand caste at kind of the level of an analogy of the Black treatment to the Dalit treatment. Once again, kind of like what you heard Dr. Pike just talk about, where she does this deep analogy between the treatment of Black women in the United States and Dalit women in India. That was not the case in the US. In the US, the caste system was understood at a high level of generalization, and it was generally used by proponents of Black equality to basically make the argument that segregation and discrimination against Blacks functioned like the caste system in India, in that it denied individualism, meritocracy, and equality that were at the heart of American culture, at least the aspirational aspects. So what caste was talked about, it was always talked about as a way of saying, look, we don't want to be like this because it's inconsistent with fundamental American values. Now, what starts to happen then as we move towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century is the African-American international view starts to change. We have in Europe and in Africa the scramble for Africa that begins in the 1880s, that starts to draw the African-American international attention to this scramble for land and colonies in Africa. Then in 1898, there's a war between the United States and Spain, and the United States comes into possession of colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, which means now Americans have to decide, what are we going to do with these people of color? But it's an international group because they're all the way over there in Asia as well as here in the Caribbean. So the African-American consciousness too is being drawn to these international events. And perhaps the international event that is the huge trigger is the defeat by Japan in 1904-1905 war with Russia, where the Japanese defeat the Russian army militarily. And W.E.B. Du Bois, writing about this, is going to say, for the first time in 1,000 years, a nation of people of color have bested a white power on the battlefield. So these developments now start to reshape the African-American international consciousness, and we begin now to look at international events through a lens of race, where we begin to talk about the existence of an alliance of people of color against white supremacy. So as we begin into the 20th century, there's this international view that the real battle here is an international battle of people of color against white supremacy. And it's within the context of understanding our place in a global struggle that we then begin to learn about the Indian freedom fighters. Lajpat Rai, the Indian freedom fighter, was in the United States from 1914 to 1919. He made a point of reaching out to activists in the Black community. He was good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois, with Booker T. Washington, with the most important Black intellectual leaders at that time. And it's through him that they begin to learn about the struggle of the Indian freedom fighters. Also, the Gator Party conspiracy, which were Indians who were in California and in Canada, send people back to India during World War I with the effort of trying to overthrow the British government. Of course, they fail, but some of their leaders get tried in the United States. And these trials of Gator Party members in the United States in 1917, 1918 are the largest trials in the United States history up to that point. So the Black community too is learning about the Indian freedom struggle as the Gator Party conspiracy trials are taken, and they last almost 6 months. The Black community learns about Gandhi, and Gandhi is very highly respected here. Not only is he respected by Du Bois, he's also respected by Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, who will have the largest popular movement of Black people in perhaps our entire history, was Jamaican. By being Jamaican, that meant he was also a subject of the British king or British royalty, but it also meant he was particularly interested in the struggle in India. The African American community understands, they followed the Salt March and even the Puna Pact. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about this because this is critical to understand. From the standpoint of African Americans in the 1930s, we had no political power. There was one Black member in Congress. Most Blacks lived in the South. 3/4 of Blacks still lived in the South, and they were not even allowed to vote. So from the standpoint of political power, Black people had very little political power. And whether Blacks with almost no political power could understand the difference between separate electorate on the one hand or reservation on the other, I think is very questionable. We would have seen either as substantial increases in our political power, whether we had reservations within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party or separate electorate. So it's not clear to me that the Black community could have understood the debates that went on between Ambedkar and Gandhi that eventually produced the Puna Pact. But from the way it was covered over here, Gandhi was seen as the hero. Gandhi's fast unto death was understood here by the Black community as him doing that for Dalits. So because he was understood as a person who was trying to lead Dalits and overthrow untouchability, that increased his standing among the Black community here in the United States. And by the time we get to the end of the roundtable discussions, then Gandhi has an incredible standing where he is being compared in the Black community to literally Jesus Christ, which is probably the highest comparison that could possibly be made. By the time we get into the mid-30s, Gandhi is going to host visits from 4 African Americans who will go on to be among the most powerful African Americans in the country. One of them is Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman will be the chair of religious studies at both Morehouse and Howard, the 2 most important historically Black colleges in the country. He also hosts Benjamin Mays. Benjamin Mays will be the dean of the School of Religion at Howard and will become the president of Morehouse University from 1940 to 1967. And he also hosts Channing Tobias. And Channing Tobias will go on to become the chairman of the NAACP and the first Black ever appointed to a presidential commission on civil rights when he's appointed by Truman, Harry S. Truman, to his commission. So that the people that Gandhi meets with then become the African Americans who are the teachers of the African American civil rights leaders of the 50s and the 60s. So not only are they the teachers of Martin Luther King Jr., but also of Jesse Jackson, of Julian Bond, of the ones who will then amount to being the civil rights leaders for the next generation. But so as African Americans come to understand the Indian freedom struggle, they begin to analogize our struggle against segregation as a struggle against a form of white supremacy is similar to the Indian freedom fighters' struggle against segregation in the form of British colonialism. Thus, there's an analogy in that we both are fighting against white supremacy. From the standpoint then of low-caste Hindus and Dalits, this move of an international perspective on the African American community from the earlier caste-based analogy now to this notion of a global struggle of people of color against white supremacy changes our view of discrimination on the Indian subcontinent. It goes from caste to white supremacy. And then the victims of oppression on the Indian subcontinent are no longer just low-caste Hindus and Dalits, but they're all Indians, including high-caste Hindus who are also victims, presumably, of white supremacy. Now, one of the other things that's important to note is that the Indian freedom fighters who both came to the United States and were recognized by the African American community were also publicly committed to abolishing untouchability. So as the African American community became to understand the Indian freedom fighters' struggle from about 1920 to Indian independence, they understood it as a struggle that was both about liberating India from white supremacy by overthrowing British colonialism, but also abolishing untouchability. And indeed, after World War II, India will in fact obtain independence, obviously, and adopt a new constitution that has several provisions in it that are intended to attack the scourge of untouchability, so that Blacks, at least by this point, are looking at Dalits and Indians saying they have more rights in the 1940s, 1950s than we did. Well, what now happens is right after World War II, the Indian freedom fighters are now termed people who run the government. And a number of things will happen after World War II that will lessen this relationship between the African American community and the Indian freedom fighters. Remember, it takes place after World War II. We have the Cold War, where India attempts to follow this position of being non-aligned, which in the United States was understood as pro-Soviet Union, and to be Black and be aligned with pro-Soviet Union groups would be was very detrimental. But a number of other things are going to happen after World War II, where today now we can look at this relationship and we can recognize 70 years after India's independence and 65 years after the Supreme Court struck down segregation in the United States, we have both come to realize simply changing the law is not enough. Changing the law does not change what's in the hearts and minds of people. You have to do more. So that in a way, the struggle that Dalits are dealing with now could be understood by the Black community as a failure of the Indian freedom fighters to carry through on their promise to eradicate untouchability. Okay, I want to stop there, and I want to quickly turn to the Cisco case. I understand that a lot of Dalits have focused and a lot of Dalit activists have focused on the Cisco case. I want to suggest that the case you also should look at is a case called Bostock versus Clayton County. This was a case that was decided by our Supreme Court on June 20th, and it was a 6-3 case. It is a case where, for purposes of Title VII, which is our major employment discrimination law, the same one that John Doe, the Dalit in the Cisco case, is also bringing a claim under. The Supreme Court in the Bostock case is going to analogize discrimination against gays and lesbians to sex discrimination. What the court is going to say is, in trying to determine whether or not a gay, lesbian, or transgendered person is discriminated based on sex under the 1964 Title VII, is we change the sex of the person. So if we have a gay man and we now make him a woman, would he still be discriminated against? And if the answer to that question is no, because he would no longer be a homosexual if he was a woman, then that's sex discrimination. So what the court said in Bostock was take homosexuality, which was something that Congress was not intending to ban in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But the plain reading of the words of the 64 Civil Rights Act, according to the court, says, here's the test. Take a gay person, change their sex. If they wouldn't be discriminated against if that gay male were now a female, that's sex discrimination. Apply that now to the Cisco case and talk about the Dalit. Take a Dalit. If you change his race from Indian or Asian to black or white, would he be discriminated against? No, because he wouldn't be a Dalit. There are no white Dalits. Therefore, the discrimination would be race discrimination. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Supreme Court has delivered to Dalits a legitimate legal argument that discrimination based on caste is unconstitutional discrimination, illegal discrimination under Title VII. And what this will depend upon is the notion that if you change the race of a Dalit to white or black, would that person still suffer the same discrimination? And that's going to then be the center of the legal argument. But I will say the Supreme Court opinion that came down in June 20th has given Dalits a much better legal argument that what is going on in Cisco is illegal under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act than what you had before. And with that, I want to stop because there may be questions.